He's known for being a protector to the people he loves. Among the people who know Chance, he's a gentle giant.
He's tall, muscular, black, big black dude, like a really husky guy. And so he could be intimidating just by his stature. But if you knew him, he's really like a big teddy bear.
A stranger came up, started arguing with Chance back and forth, opened fire, and then ran off.
He was just reaching out for me, like, I couldn't understand what he was saying. He couldn't really get the words out, but I just kept telling him I was there.
The family is just livid that nothing has been done.
A lot of the beef stems from one person having a beef with someone else, and now their whole family and friends are involved.
Sometimes the street has its own investigation and street justice is imposed, and it is almost always deadly.
That whole eye for an eye leaves us all blind.
At 3:30 p.m. on March 23, 2012, multiple 911 calls suddenly pour in from the 100 block of Kenmore Avenue on Syracuse's south side.
Syracuse is a small town. We have a big university. That's pretty much what we're known for, Syracuse University. Right outside, like literally down the street from the university, is the south side. Right below the university is poverty.
The south side of Syracuse is a high poverty area, a lot of violence. It can be scary. It can be scary for someone that does not know the area.
I was just fresh out of the academy as a police officer, and I remember the call, shots fired call came in, shooting, that a male had been shot. We were close by, so we were able to respond pretty quickly. So the scene was still very fresh, very chaotic, where people were outside, so there was people all over. The residents were pointing to where the victim was. I remember running up to the house, it was a white house, green porch, I'll never forget.
The victim, a black male in his 30s, lies just a few feet away.
There was a construction worker in the area that had quickly responded before we got there, and he was helping do some first aid. Then we took over, me and my partner.
He's shot. What appears to be, a single gunshot wound to his lower back.
There was still some level of consciousness, gasping for air. I remember that vividly. He grabbed onto the uniform and, said, "Help me."
Paramedics arrive, followed by several of the victim's family members who have gotten word of the shooting.
One of the first things we learned after talking to bystanders is that the victim is 33-year-old Chance Gathers.
He could see me. He was looking at me, reaching for me. He was just reaching out for me, like, I couldn't understand what he was saying. He couldn't really get the words out, but I just kept telling him I was there.
As Chance is loaded in the ambulance, the responding officers attempt to speak with him.
The only chance we might have to identify the suspect would be from what the victim tells us.
But Chance can no longer speak.
Basically just gasping for air. He couldn't talk.
Chance David Gathers was born on October 14, 1978 in Syracuse, New York, to Onetha Gathers and Haywood Richardson Jr.
Chance Gathers is a native of Syracuse. This is his hometown. He's from a big family. Chance has 2 sisters on his mother's side, and on his father's side, he's one of 22 children. So this is a huge family.
He had a good relationship with his mom. He even had a good relationship with his dad. His dad had a lot of kids, and he did what he could. He was there for them.
He had the brightest, most beautiful white smile. Everything was funny. You know what I mean? It was always a joke. He asked a lot of questions. He was very observant.
While still a young man himself, Chance's siblings began having kids. Chance quickly became the favorite uncle.
He would go get a haircut. He would have to go grab nephews and little cousins and godsons and always have a bunch of kids with him getting haircut just every week.
Chance was like one of those warm spirits that, like you said, made me feel safe and, always inquired and always would talk to me and ask me what I was thinking, how I was feeling. His hugs were unmatched.
He's known for being a protector to the people he loves. He's sort of among the people who know Chance, he's a gentle giant.
He's tall, muscular, big black dude, like a really husky guy. And so he could be intimidating just by his stature. But if you knew him, he's really like a big teddy bear.
On the street, Chance learned to use his size to his advantage.
He was actually bullied a lot as a child, him and his big sister. They got into a lot of fights and picked on until it like kind of made him like, okay, I'm gonna show y'all. Like, and he had that chip on his shoulder for a long time. And it got him in prison, landed him in prison.
He was actually in jail for, I want to say like 11 years he did.
At the age of 30, Chance was released, and he was determined to stay out of prison for good.
When he came home, that's that inner battle that he was fighting. Like who he truly was, that God-fearing, praying man, family man, versus not wanting to back down from what he might have used to be or like what people perceive him to be. He really, that's not ever what he wanted, but like, he did have that battle. But some of the biggest things that he wanted to accomplish was to have his own family, raise his own family. He didn't have any children.
Within a couple of years, Chance felt steady enough to take a step in that direction. He started dating single mother Marisha Stenson.
Chance absolutely courted me. He was very persistent. And it was kind of like matter of fact, like we're together now. And it wasn't in a way where I was like, run, It was like he was really serious about me. Like any other connections that he had at the time, he clearly was like, look, I'm calling her, anybody, there's nobody but you.
We were talking and he was like, yo, I love her. I love her. She's so beautiful. Like, yo, Nunu, you don't understand. Like, she do something to me.
6 months into the relationship, Chance popped the question.
He wanted to get married. He told me our date would be June 1st. He set a date and everything. He was really romantic.
Before they could make it to the altar, in April 2012, Chance and Marisha learned they were going to be parents.
When I finally did get pregnant, he was so happy. Like me, I'm like, oh, I got this 4-year-old already. I don't know if I really even need a baby, but if you're happy, I'm happy. Like we're doing this. But he was so excited.
He wasn't one just out here moving around with, having kids with different women and things like that. Like this was gonna be his first child. He was proud. He was excited.
Chances at this point, he's really looking forward to the next phase in his life. Him and his girlfriend are expecting a child, and that's going to be the biggest thing ever for Chance. This is someone looking ahead to a future with a child and a wife.
But just a few months into the pregnancy, a shooting in broad daylight has Chance fighting for his life. As doctors at University Hospital attempt to save the father-to-be, detectives arrive at the crime scene. They piece together the moments around the shooting.
He tried getting away when the suspect was shooting at him, and you could see that he was eating his food on the porch when that had happened. And it looked like he tried to escape into the backyard to prevent getting fired upon.
Instead, Chance was shot once in the back as he tried to flee.
We don't know where the suspect necessarily ran off to or if he ditched the firearm. So a scene like that, you end up taking almost the whole block that the homicide occurred on, putting up crime scene tape.
They began searching the entire block for physical evidence. Blood splatters, shell casings, things of that nature. They found multiple shell casings on the ground.
We have to figure out what happened. Everyone was still around, so we knew we had some witnesses.
A lot of people were there. It was broad daylight, so people saw this.
Witnesses eagerly point out a link between the gunman and the item police have just discovered.
Police discover a dark-colored cap, and after talking to witnesses, they discovered that it was the shooter's cap.
He had on a hat, a black and blue hat, and a white t-shirt.
If investigators can find the owner of the hat, they might also find the gunman.
Who would want Chance Gathers dead? Who is it that was so bold they decided to just go up to him in broad daylight and shoot him right in front of people?
When detectives looking into the murder of 33-year-old Chance Gathers speak to those who witnessed the brazen crime, they learn the shooter was wearing a dark hat.
If the lab team can find DNA on this hat that was found on the ground, this would be the key to identifying the shooter.
Witnesses give details surrounding the moment the chaos broke out.
Chance was hanging out with a small group of friends on that porch.
We were sitting on a porch, and this young man, came up and he went to go, shooting up on a porch.
Witnesses explained that they did not recognize the shooter. They described that a stranger came up, started arguing with Chance back and forth, opened fire, and then ran off.
Given the fact that no one else was shot, detectives believe the shooter was after one man.
This does not appear to be a random shooting. This looks like a targeted shooting, that someone was trying to very specifically mark this person as their victim.
With no witnesses able to identify the shooter, investigators consider whether they're holding back.
There's people who saw this shooting and they know what happened. Easy enough, right? Just talk to them, solve the crime, right? That's not how it works.
We don't tend to get a lot of cooperation from the community, especially in those high crime areas. So we've had incidents where there's been a shots fired and we'll show up and people sitting on the front porch say they didn't hear or see anything. And just because you're wearing a badge doesn't mean that they're going to want to give information.
There's the don't snitch culture. It's not something that people are comfortable doing, and with good reason. Because if you go to the police and you cooperate and it's known, well, then there could be a target on you.
As investigators wrap up at the crime scene, Chance's friends and family rush to the hospital. They wait on pins and needles for news.
I ran to Upstate Hospital, like up the hill, full speed, no brakes, up the hill. And when I got there, a couple of my family was there. Some of his friends were there.
Nobody can answer questions. His mom gets there, a couple other family members get there. And, eventually they come out with the, I'm sorry, he didn't make it.
The bullet struck Chance in the lower back, and then it traveled up in his body, puncturing his kidney and his aorta, which caused him to bleed to death.
I've seen miracles happen at the hospital, but depending on that round and where it decided to travel in the body, it can just cause significant damage, which you don't have a chance to save.
And my aunt, she just let out this like scream that like will make your skin crawl.
We just need you to identify the body. So his mother and I, we go to the room where he's like laying on a table, naked on the sheet. I mean, it was really hard. It was really hard because being pregnant by itself is already hard, but like dealing with grief and then not knowing what's next.
Word of Chance's passing reaches detectives.
Police were hopeful that Chance would be able to identify his shooter. But now they won't get that opportunity. Therefore, they must continue the investigation in order to get justice for Chance.
Who is this guy who walked up in broad daylight and shot a bullet, taking the life of Chance Gathers as he sat on a porch eating? Who is this person, and why did this person decide to commit this horrible act?
Still certain that Chance's death was a targeted attack, investigators take a look into his background. They learn that prior to his release from prison 3 years earlier, Chance had a reputation both on the streets and with police.
Chance Gathers was someone that was on law enforcement's radar. Just looking back, even when he was 14, there was some contact with law enforcement. So there had been a significant time period. If you'd mentioned his name in roll call amongst other officers, he was well known.
Police discover that Chance had a dark past. He had a criminal history stemming back all the way to 1999.
Chance has had some problems. He's been in a prison. He's been in prison for serious stuff.
Since his release, Chance walked a fine line between staying out of trouble with the law and on the street.
It's very difficult to get labels off of you when they're on. They're attached to you almost forever, unfortunately, especially in a small town like Syracuse. Everyone knows each other, so it's hard. And they talk.
To some people, Chance did have a reputation for being somewhat of a bully, right? The way he explained it to me was like, and what I actually saw was that he would only bully bullies.
You couldn't come around Chance and front like you was this big dog. Because if you big dog, he want to see. Show me you big dog. He was Mr. Size You Up.
Chance is looking forward to this new part of his life, but the old part of his life is still there, and he's not shying away from it. You know, the old days of Chance being a guy to be reckoned with, he's still very aware of it, and so are other people. And that reputation is going to lead, unfortunately, to some real beefs.
Detectives also learned that Chance's tough guy image hadn't completely protected him.
Chance was being both a participant and also a victim of crime. He had been slashed across his face in the past.
In 1991, Chance arrived at the hospital with a stab wound, but the details of that stabbing were never made clear to police.
Investigators consider whether Chance's killer was attempting to settle a score.
Due to Chance's extensive criminal history, the list of suspects was pretty long.
There's a thing called street justice, and unfortunately, there's no statute of limitations on it. If the street is viewing you as someone who's behind something and there's people that want to hold you accountable for it, unfortunately, that very often results in tragic death.
Detectives in Syracuse are trying to identify the man who fatally shot Chance Gathers in broad daylight.
The reality is that Chance's reputation is going to follow him. And because as much of a gentle giant as he can be, he wasn't always a gentle giant on the streets.
Detectives had their work cut out for them in order to narrow down the list of suspects. Detectives went down a list of anyone who could be seeking payback, and then they moved on and also eliminated anyone who had attempted against Chance's life prior to his death. Detectives worked their way down a list of people who may have felt Chance had wronged them, and one by one, they eliminated suspect after suspect.
And no one in Chance's circle is offering help.
No one came forward. It's either due to fear, it's either due to, well, let the police handle it. Well, the police need help with solving these cases.
A huge problem for police in upstate New York is getting community trust, because at the end of the day, to solve a crime, you need people to come forward.
2 days after Chance's murder, Syracuse police set up an anonymous tip line, hopeful that the promise of secrecy will encourage someone to come forward.
We have an app where people can send anonymous tips, and I can't even look up your name, even if you want to, but we give people that anonymous option.
Anytime you open up a tip line, you have to take the good with the bad. And now detectives are having to sit through information that's senseless and really has nothing to do with the case.
Most of the tips are dead ends, except for one.
Not only does this person say they witnessed the murder, they also say they recognize the shooter.
So there's a name making its way to police. Police are starting to hear the name Demetrius Hackett.
Demetrius Hackett was born on July 21st, 1992, the second son to Kimberly Freeman and Benjamin Hackett.
The Hackett family was very well known on the west side of Syracuse. They go back generations. Demetrius had an older brother named Pierre, as well as some uncles and many cousins.
A pivotal moment for the Hackett family came on February 23, 1997, when Pierre and Demetrius's grandmother, Virginia, was shot and killed inside her home. 2 of her teenage grandsons were also injured in the shooting.
It was later determined that the shooting was intended for another member of Demetrius' family.
The shooting threatened to shatter the Hackett family, but in the end, it brought them closer. Pierre took his role as older brother seriously. He was intent on keeping Demetrius out of trouble.
Pierre did have some run-ins with the law and was involved in some street activities, but his main focus was to ensure that his brother was not part of that lifestyle.
Investigators are puzzled.
Demetrius Hackett is someone who doesn't have a criminal record. He doesn't have a street reputation. It's the opposite. It's a 19-year-old kid who's a football player. He doesn't have any sort of rap sheet. He doesn't have any sort of violent reputation. He's a good kid. And he's someone who, at face value, is, why are you looking at this kid? He's someone who has his whole future ahead of him. And frankly, you know, why would he be involved in something like that?
Then detectives learned that the Hackett family had recently suffered another tremendous loss.
Demetrius' older brother, Pierre, was killed in a shooting in the same neighborhood just 7 months prior.
Investigators take a look at the case file on Pierre's murder. In that moment, the connection between suspect and victim becomes crystal clear.
And whose name appears at the top of the list as a prime suspect? None other than Chance Gathers.
Homicide detectives in Syracuse, New York, finally have a potential suspect in the March 2012 murder of Chance Gathers. The name Demetrius Hackett comes by way of an anonymous tip.
On August 1st, 2011, Demetrius Hackett's brother, Pierre Hackett, was shot and killed broad daylight in the city of Syracuse as he's walking down the street.
During the investigation into Pierre Hackett's murder, a name kept popping up: Chance Gathers.
Investigators dig into the case file.
Pierre Hackett was walking with his cousin, Leroy Hackett Jr., and Leroy's 2 children, leaving a store on the south side of Syracuse.
Suddenly, gunshots rang out.
Pierre told his cousin and the children to run to safety, and he then turned in the direction of the gunfire and was shot in the head once. His father, Benjamin Hackett, was sitting in the car and watched as his son was gunned down right in front of his eyes. A neighbor administered CPR until the ambulance arrived, but Pierre later died in the hospital.
Witnesses on the scene did not see the shooter, but all agreed the gunfire came from the direction of a nearby intersection.
The gunman used a pine tree at that intersection to stay concealed.
According to the report, Chance became a suspect when investigators learned of a beef between him and Pierre.
A lot of the beef stems from one wants to overpower the other, or one person having a beef with someone else, and now their whole family and friends are involved. You know, just the social pressure of, oh, if you don't take care of it, well, I'll take care of it.
It could be a beef over anything, a slight, a perceived slight, someone hitting on a girlfriend.
There were unrelated problems between Chance's friend Pep and Pierre's friend Suave. Pep and Suave were enemies because allegedly, Pep shot Suave's brother Dave years prior.
Suave and Pierre Hackett, they were beefing with Pep, so they still had active beef or whatever. And now Pierre is around or whatever. Pep is hanging with Chance.
In 2011, Pep asked Chance to come along with him while he attempted to broker peace between himself and Suave. When they arrived, Pierre was also there to back up Suave. But instead of striking a truce, tempers flared, mainly Pep's.
When they pull up, Pep started talking crazy, like complete opposite of what was supposed to transpire. And that commenced the beef between them.
Suddenly, Pierre and Chance were also mired in the explosive conflict. When Pierre is gunned down in broad daylight just weeks later, Chance's one-time friend turns on him.
Next thing you know, Pep is over there at the Hackett's dad's house telling them Chance did it.
The Hackett family took Pep's word for the truth.
The Hackett family is convinced that Chance has killed Pierre.
But Chance specifically told me out his mouth, he said, man, I ain't do that, man.
Investigators working the case failed to find any evidence tying Chance or Pep to the murder.
As of March 2012, when Chance Gathers was gunned down, the murder of Pierre Hackett was still considered an open investigation.
Pierre's family is convinced Chance Gathers pulled the trigger that killed Pierre. The police are not so sure, or if they are, the police aren't bringing any charges. The family is just livid that nothing has been done.
Especially Pierre's doting younger brother, Demetrius.
Demetrius is a very emotional guy. He's hot. He's angry. His brother was murdered. He is just completely devastated, as is his family. It's a horrible situation. Demetrius Hackett, someone with no criminal history, who under any other circumstances would never be looked at as a possible suspect in a homicide, is now looking like a prime suspect in the homicide of Chance Gathers. Because he blames Chance for killing his brother, and this is eating away at him.
There's now possible motive for Demetrius to want to retaliate against Chance. There's also a witness who identified Demetrius at the shooting. So now, Demetrius has to be brought in for questioning.
But when detectives go in search of Demetrius Hackett, he's nowhere to be found.
No one, not even his parents, seem to know where he's gone. They don't know if he's laying low, letting the heat die down, or on the run. The fact of the matter is that they cannot get any information as to his whereabouts. They knew that if they had any chance of finding him, they would have to get a warrant and the Marshal Squad involved, and hopefully get him in alive.
Detectives in Syracuse have issued a warrant for the arrest of Demetrius Hackett.
They had information that the Hackett family believed that Chance was responsible for the death of Demetrius' older brother, Pierre, back in August 2011. Which would lead them to also believe that Chance's murder was perhaps a retaliation. When detectives cannot find Demetrius, they worry that perhaps he might have fled the state. So they go door to door in different neighborhoods in Syracuse trying to find him. Despite the fact that detectives kept hearing that Demetrius was a good kid, he was still considered armed and dangerous, and their job was to get him off the streets as soon as possible.
We just lost a life, and we have to get justice for this life.
Finally, on April 9th, 2012, more than 2 weeks after Chance's murder, the warrant squad tracks down Demetrius Hackett.
So 18 days after the homicide, Demetrius Hackett, who's been in hiding, suddenly is arrested. Demetrius is arrested and charged with the murder of Chance Gathers.
When they arrested Demetrius and charged him, and I found out like the motive was because he thought Chance killed his brother. It was just a real sad situation. 2 guys dead and 1 in jail.
During his interrogation, Demetrius denies any involvement in the murder of Chance Gathers.
Syracuse police are grilling Demetrius about this incident. Demetrius isn't budging. Demetrius isn't going to confess to this crime.
Even without a confession or any physical evidence connecting him to the crime, Demetrius Hackett is charged with second-degree murder.
When Demetrius is arraigned at the courthouse the following day, his mother and father waste no time pleading their son's innocence to the media that gathered outside of the courthouse.
They allege that Chance Gathers had been leveling threats at their family in the months since Pierre's murder.
The Hackett family say that Chance has been terrorizing them for months as they're mourning the death of their loved one. They say he's making their life a living hell on the streets of Syracuse, New York.
Investigators stay focused, knowing they must tighten their case against Demetrius. And there is one item in evidence that could give them what they need.
The baseball cap found at Chance's murder scene dropped by the killer. The DNA lab was able to pull a DNA sample from the baseball cap.
They want to test that hat he left at the scene for DNA. It's a risky move because, yes, DNA is extremely powerful evidence. That can cut both ways because as sure as a DNA match could convict Demetrius, if there's no match, that could be an immediate, huge piece of evidence to just let Demetrius get an acquittal.
Investigators are willing to take the risk, but Demetrius isn't.
Demetrius was asked to provide DNA sample at his own will, but he refused.
Investigators in Syracuse are desperate to strengthen the case against 19-year-old Demetrius Hackett in the shooting death of his alleged enemy, Chance Gathers.
So the police and prosecutors, they think they have their man in Demetrius Hackett. They want to test that hat left at the scene for DNA.
Demetrius, while in custody, was asked to provide DNA sample at his own will, but he refused. So prosecutors went in front of the judge in May 2012 and asked that he was court-ordered to provide DNA sample.
If there's no match, Demetrius is probably gonna walk from this crime because what's tying him to this murder? Nothing, other than the fact that his name has come up. And without DNA evidence, I don't think you have a murder case against Demetrius Hackett. The DNA is gonna tell the tale. Is Demetrius involved in this crime or is he not?
A judge signs off on the subpoena. Investigators collect a saliva sample from Demetrius, and then they wait.
The DNA testing comes back, and yes, it's a match. That was the hat being worn by Demetrius Hackett. His DNA is now on it, and what's more, witnesses saw him wearing it. This is really hard now for Demetrius to say he was not involved. You can now put Demetrius Hackett at that crime scene, and you could put him there wearing that hat.
Demetrius and his attorneys maintain his innocence despite the new evidence.
His lawyers are starting to consider a new tactic. Demetrius was under an extreme emotional distress at the time he pulled the trigger. This means we're no longer going to deny that he shot Chance, but we're going to show you why he did it.
Extreme emotional distress is a response to a traumatic event where you have a loss of self-control, intense, overwhelming emotions in response to, the traumatic event. Demetrius had good grades. He didn't have a criminal record. This was a traumatic event for him, which may have caused him, to be dealing with extreme emotional distress. This is why his lawyer wanted to argue this for his case.
Prosecutors must consider that this argument could work.
Who's to say that a jury may look at him and say, oh man, we're gonna let this kid get acquitted because he was obviously in a horrible situation. The prosecution knows that, and Demetrius and his attorneys know that. But they also know that if the jury comes back and says, no, it's murder, he's looking at a life sentence.
Prosecutors pursue a plea. On August 30th, 2013, almost a year and a half after Chance's murder, Demetrius Hackett pleads guilty to a reduced charge of first-degree manslaughter.
Demetrius has pled guilty to first-degree manslaughter. He's gonna get a chance to finally speak about what happened on the day that he shot and killed Chance Gathers. Demetrius tells the judge this was a lose-lose situation. Chance Gathers was terrorizing my family. If I didn't take this into my own hands, I'd be dead. He felt it was a kill or be killed type situation and that he made the decision to take out Chance Gathers before Chance Gathers could take out him and members of his family.
Demetrius said in court that he felt like pretty much he had no choice. He said that Chance was threatening him and his family.
The judge responds.
So the judge tells Demetrius that there was no criminal case against Chance Gathers. The police hadn't charged him with that. So even if everybody on the street and in the family knew or heavily suspected Chance killed Pierre, you can't kill someone just because you believe they killed your brother. The court system is not going to justify an eye for an eye. They're just not going to do it.
The judge sentences Demetrius Hackett to 20 years at the Wint Correctional Facility in upstate New York. He'll be eligible for parole in 2029.
At the end of the day, this is a very tragic story about retribution and how the cycle of violence just leads to prison and more tragedy. It certainly does in this case. At the end of the day, Chance Gathers is dead. And Demetrius Hackett is going to be in a prison for the next 20 years. Demetrius wasn't a bad kid. Demetrius was on the right track. The only thing that happened to Demetrius was his family became victim to the cycle of violence in this country. And unfortunately, Demetrius decided to handle it himself.
In this case, one man's struggle with grief became another family's permanent loss.
The changes he made right before he died, like, I'd rather have had that chance just for a little while than the old chance, because, like, I know for sure he's in heaven. At some point, you do have to break the cycle. Somebody has to do it. I feel like it's only us that can change the culture of the streets and the way that we conduct ourselves. That whole eye for an eye leaves us all blind.
There are crimes that shock a city. There are crimes that remain in the memory of an entire region for decades. And then there are crimes that leave behind a question that people continue to ask long after the investigators have left the scene. How could something so terrible happen inside a home that was supposed to be a place of safety? The Satar family murders became one of the most horrifying family massacres in the history of Manitoba, Canada. It was not a crime that happened in a crowded street, under the eyes of strangers. It happened behind the walls of a family home, a place where people slept, a place where children dreamed, a place where ordinary moments of daily life had once filled every room. But on one terrible night, that home became the scene of an unimaginable tragedy. 7 members of the Satar family were found dead after a brutal attack. The weapon used was simple, but the violence was devastating. An axe and a knife became the tools of destruction. The victims were attacked while they were asleep, unaware that danger had entered the place where they should have been safest. After the killings, the house was set on fire. The flames were meant to erase evidence, to hide what had happened, to destroy the traces of a crime that would later horrify investigators and the public. But fire could not erase the truth. It could not erase the lives that had been lost. It could not erase the memories of the people who knew the Satar family. When authorities arrived, they were not simply investigating a crime scene. They were entering the remains of a family's entire world. A home that had once contained conversations, meals, laughter, and ordinary routines was now silent. Every object left behind carried a painful reminder that people had been there only hours before. The Satar family was not known because of tragedy. Before that night, they were simply a family trying to live their lives. They had their own habits, their own relationships, their own hopes for the future. Like many families, they had moments of happiness and moments of difficulty. They had built a life together. And that was what made the crimes so disturbing. The victims were not strangers. They were people connected by family bonds. People who trusted the person who was inside their home. The investigation would later focus on a shocking possibility, that the person responsible was someone who had been close enough to enter their lives. Someone who was not a random stranger walking through the night. The idea that danger could come from someone familiar made the case even more frightening. For investigators, one of the most difficult parts of the case was understanding the motive. Why would someone target an entire family? Why would a person decide that 7 lives should end in such a violent way? Questions like these would follow the investigation from the beginning. In the hours after the discovery, the community struggled to understand what had happened. Neighbors who had lived near the family were left searching for explanations. How could such horror exist behind a normal-looking home? How could a quiet area become connected to one of Manitoba's most disturbing crimes? Fear spread quickly. People began looking differently at the people around them. A familiar face could now create uncertainty. A simple interaction could suddenly seem suspicious. That is one of the deepest effects of crimes like this. They do not only destroy lives, they change how communities see the world. The investigators who entered the burned home faced a difficult task. They needed to reconstruct the final moments of the victims. They needed to determine what happened before the fire. They needed to separate what the flames had destroyed from what evidence remained. Every detail mattered. A small piece of information could reveal a larger truth. A mark at the scene, a timeline, a statement from someone who knew the family, a detail that seemed insignificant at first. Criminal investigations are often built from these small pieces. But in a case involving the murder of an entire family, the pressure was enormous. The public wanted answers. The relatives wanted justice. And investigators knew that finding the person responsible was not only about solving a crime, it was about giving the victims a voice. Because the dead could no longer speak. They could not explain what happened. They could not identify who entered their home. They could not describe their final moments. The responsibility fell on those left behind. The police, the investigators, the community, everyone searching for the truth. As the details of the massacre began to emerge, the case became more than a local tragedy. It became a symbol of the darkest possibility in human behavior. The idea that a place filled with trust and love could become the location of an unimaginable act. The home, which should represent protection, had become the final place the victims would ever see. And behind that fact was the most painful reality of all. The Sattar family had no idea that their lives were about to change forever. They went to sleep believing they would wake up the next day. They believed tomorrow would come like any other day. But instead, their story became one of the most haunting criminal cases remembered in Manitoba. A story of loss. A story of unanswered questions. A story of an investigation into one of the most devastating attacks ever experienced by a family. And as investigators began searching for the truth, one question remained at the center of everything. Who could commit such an act, and why? The answer would reveal a story filled with betrayal, violence, and a shocking reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers are not found outside the walls of a home. Sometimes, they're already inside. Before the Sattar family became known because of one of the most horrifying crimes in Manitoba's history, they were simply a family living an ordinary life. Their home was not a place connected to fear. It was not a place where anyone expected violence. Like many homes across Canada, it was a place filled with daily routines, familiar voices, and small moments that rarely seem important until they are suddenly gone. A home is often more than just walls and a roof. It is where people feel protected. It is where families create memories. It is where children grow up, where meals are shared, where conversations happen at the end of a long day. That feeling of safety was exactly what made the crime so disturbing. The tragedy did not happen in a distant, unknown location. It happened in a place connected to family, trust, and everyday life. The Sattar family lived in Manitoba, a province known for its wide landscapes, cold winters, and close communities where neighbors often know each other. In many areas, people take comfort in familiarity. They recognize the faces around them. They know the homes on their street. They believe that ordinary surroundings create a sense of security. But the events that unfolded would destroy that sense of certainty. The community was forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. A peaceful-looking home can hide unimaginable darkness. Before the murders, the Sattar family had their own story. They had built a life together. They had relationships, responsibilities, and dreams. They were not figures in a crime investigation. They were parents, relatives, and family members who had everyday concerns like anyone else. They woke up each morning thinking about normal things. They planned their days. They cared about the people around them. They had no reason to believe that their home would become the center of a devastating crime. This is often what makes family murders so difficult for communities to understand. There is a natural belief that families are supposed to be safe together. The home is supposed to be the place where people escape the dangers of the outside world. But when violence enters that space, it creates a different kind of fear. It challenges the basic idea of security. For investigators, understanding the environment around the family became an important part of the case. They needed to know not only what happened during the attack, but also what life had been like before it. Who knew the family? Who had access to the home? Who might have had a reason to harm them? Every relationship had to be examined. Every connection had to be considered. In a case involving 7 victims, investigators could not focus only on one person. They had to understand the entire family dynamic. They had to look at the people who surrounded them. The tragedy also raised difficult questions about trust. The person responsible for such a violent act did not simply attack a location. They attacked people who had opened their home and their lives to others. That element of betrayal made the crime even more painful. A stranger committing violence is terrifying, but when violence comes from someone who has been allowed into a family's world, the emotional damage is even deeper. After the murders became known, many people in Manitoba struggled with the same question. How could someone do this? The brutality of the attack was difficult to comprehend. The idea that 7 members of one family could lose their lives in a single night created a level of shock that extended far beyond those who personally knew them. People followed the investigation closely. They wanted answers. They wanted to understand what kind of person could commit such an act. But before the investigation could reveal the truth, the community had to face the reality of the loss. A family was gone. A home was destroyed. A sense of normal life had been replaced by grief. The fire that followed the murders added another layer of horror to the case. Fire has always been associated with destruction. It consumes objects. It changes familiar places into something unrecognizable. When investigators examined the burned remains of the house, they were not only searching for evidence, they were looking through the remains of a family's final moments. The flames had damaged the scene, but they could not remove the truth. Every investigation begins with uncertainty. At first, there are more questions than answers. A crime scene can reveal pieces of information, but it does not immediately explain the full story. Investigators must rebuild events like a puzzle. They must determine what happened first, what happened next, and how everything led to the final outcome. In the Satar family murders, the scale of the tragedy made this process even more challenging. 7 lives had been taken. 7 different stories had been interrupted. 7 people who had their own place in the world were suddenly gone. The investigation was not only about finding a criminal, it was about understanding the loss. It was about giving meaning to the lives behind the headlines. As news spread, the case became a reminder of how fragile a sense of safety can be. Many families across Manitoba looked at their own homes and thought about what had happened. They wondered about the people around them. They wondered how well they truly knew those in their lives. Fear often grows from uncertainty, and at that moment, there were many uncertainties. The community did not yet know who was responsible. They did not know why such a terrible act had happened. They only knew that a family had been taken away. Slowly, investigators would begin to uncover the details. They would look into relationships, movements, and evidence. They would search for the truth hidden behind the fire and violence. But before the answers came, there was only the silence left behind. A silence where a family's voices had once been. A silence that would remain connected forever to one of Manitoba's darkest nights. The Satar family murders were not remembered because of the crime alone. They were remembered because of what was lost. A family, a home, a sense of peace, and a question that would continue to haunt everyone searching for the truth. What happened inside the house on the night when everything changed forever? Before the Satar family became a name connected to one of Manitoba's most disturbing crimes, they were simply people living their lives. They had routines. They had relationships. They had memories that existed far away from the darkness that would later surround their name. When a tragedy of this scale happens, the public often remembers the crime first, the headlines, the investigation, the shocking details. But behind every terrible event are real people whose lives were much bigger than the moment they were taken away. The Satar family were not just victims in a criminal case. They were individuals. They were family members. They were people who had dreams, responsibilities, and connections to the world around them. Each person had their own personality, their own experiences, their own place within the family. And understanding that human side is important because a crime like this is not only about what happened, it is also about who was lost. Families are built through thousands of ordinary moments. A conversation during a meal, a familiar voice in the hallway, a shared laugh, a simple routine repeated every day. These moments often seem insignificant while they are happening, but after a tragedy, those are the memories that become the most valuable. For those who knew the Sattar family, the pain was not only about losing people, it was about losing the future they were supposed to have. Future conversations that would never happen. Future celebrations that would never take place. Future memories that would never be created. That is the true weight of a family tragedy. It does not only end lives, it changes the lives of everyone left behind. The Sattar family had created a home that represented stability, a place where family members could gather, a place where daily life continued with its normal challenges and joys. Like any family, they were not defined by one single moment. They were defined by years of experiences, by the relationships between them, by the bond that connected them. That bond is what made the crime so painful to understand. The attack did not simply remove individuals from the world. It destroyed an entire family unit. 7 people who were connected by blood, love, and shared history were suddenly gone. For investigators, this reality was impossible to ignore. They were not investigating a single loss. They were investigating the destruction of an entire household. Every victim represented a separate life, a separate story, a separate group of people who cared about them. Behind the police reports and evidence files were families and friends trying to process something that felt impossible. There is a particular kind of grief that follows a violent crime. It is different from other forms of loss, because along with sadness comes the need to understand. People ask questions. What happened? Why did it happen? Could anything have been different? Those questions often remain long after the investigation ends. For the relatives and people close to the Sattar family, the tragedy was not just something they read about or watched in the news. It was something that changed their lives forever. The victims had their own identities beyond the crime. They had their own memories, their own personalities, their own importance to the people around them. But when a case becomes famous, there is always a danger that the victims become reduced to a few sentences, a number, a location, a detail in an investigation. That is why remembering who they were matters. Because every person lost in a tragedy had a life before the tragedy. They had mornings when they woke up and expected another ordinary day. They had plans. They had concerns that had nothing to do with crime. They had moments of happiness that would never appear in a newspaper. The Sattar family murders became especially disturbing because the victims were not lost in a random public attack. They were in their own home, a place where people normally lower their guard, a place where they expected protection. The idea that a family could be attacked while sleeping created a deep sense of fear. Sleep represents vulnerability. It represents the moment when people trust the world around them enough to close their eyes. The victims had that trust, and that trust was violently broken. As investigators began examining the case, they had to reconstruct not only the crime, but the lives that came before it. They needed to understand the family. They needed to understand the people connected to them. They needed to discover what relationships existed around the victims. Every detail mattered because the victims themselves could no longer tell their story. The investigation had to speak for them. The community also carried the memory of the family. When a crime affects an entire area, people often remember not only the event but the feeling of that time. The shock, the sadness, the uncertainty, the moment when a familiar place became associated with something unimaginable. The Sattar family murders became one of those cases, a case that remained in the memory of Manitoba because of the scale of the loss. But even decades later, the most important part of the story remains the same. The victims were people. They were not simply part of a mystery, waiting to be solved. They were not just names connected to a crime scene. They were human beings whose lives mattered. Their story existed before the tragedy. And that story deserves to be remembered, because every investigation eventually reaches a conclusion. Evidence is collected. suspects are identified, courts make decisions, but the memory of the victims continues. For the Sattar family, the world remembers the night when everything changed, but those who cared about them remember something else. They remember the people they were before that night. They remember the family that existed before the horror. And that is the part of the story that must never disappear. There are moments in history that divide life into two parts, before and after. For the Sattar family, that division happened during one night that would forever remain one of the darkest chapters in Manitoba's criminal history. Before that night, the home was just a home, a place where family members lived their everyday lives, a place where the sounds of normal routines filled the rooms, a place where people went to sleep believing that the next morning would arrive like any other. But during those final hours, something changed. The safety that a home represents disappeared. The ordinary became something terrifying. And when investigators later tried to reconstruct what happened, they were forced to look into a scene that revealed not only violence, but a devastating betrayal of trust. The attack was carried out while the family was asleep. This detail became one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. The victims were not confronted in a public place. They were not given a warning. They were attacked in the place where they should have felt most protected. The home, which should have been a shelter from the outside world, became the location of unimaginable violence. The weapon used was an axe and a knife. Simple objects that became connected forever to one of Manitoba's most horrifying crimes. The brutality of the attack shocked investigators. They were faced with the reality that multiple lives had been taken inside a family residence. A place where memories had been created was now a crime scene. A place where people had eaten, talked, and rested was now filled with questions. When authorities began examining the events, they knew they were dealing with a crime unlike most others. A single violent act against one person is already difficult to understand, but the murder of an entire family creates a different level of horror. It forces investigators to search for not only evidence, but meaning. What could cause someone to enter a home and destroy so many lives? What kind of anger, motive, or planning could lead to such a decision? Those questions would become central to the investigation. The hours after the discovery were filled with confusion and disbelief. For the community, the news seemed impossible. A family had been found dead. A home had been destroyed. A quiet area had suddenly become connected to an event that people struggled to comprehend. Neighbors who had known the family were left trying to understand how such violence could happen so close to them. Many people experience fear differently after a crime like this. It is not only fear of the crime itself, it is fear of the unknown. The thought that something so terrible could happen in an ordinary place changes the way people see their surroundings. A familiar street can suddenly feel different. A normal evening can suddenly feel less safe. That emotional impact spread throughout Manitoba as details of the massacre became known. But while the public reacted with shock, investigators had a different task. They had to remain focused. They had to separate emotion from evidence. They had to carefully examine every part of the scene. Because in a crime of this magnitude, every detail matters. The smallest piece of information can become important. A movement, a conversation, a connection between people, a timeline. Investigators needed to understand the final moments before the attack. They needed to determine who had access to the home, who knew the family, who had a possible motive, and most importantly, who could commit such an act. The fire added another layer of complexity. After the murders, the house was set on fire in an attempt to destroy evidence. The flames changed the scene. They damaged the environment where the crime occurred. They created additional challenges for investigators. But fire does not erase everything. It can destroy objects. It can damage physical evidence. But it cannot completely remove the truth. Investigators worked to recover whatever information remained. They searched through the damage. They studied what survived. They looked for the story hidden beneath the destruction. A crime scene is often described as a place of evidence. But in cases like this, it is also a place filled with human loss. Every room represented something that once belonged to a family. Every remaining object carried a connection to people who were no longer there. The investigation was not simply about discovering what happened. It was about understanding the final moments of 7 lives. The brutality of the attack also created another important question. Was this random, or was it planned? The answer would determine the direction of the entire investigation. A random crime suggests one kind of danger. A planned attack suggests something different. It suggests preparation. It suggests intention. And if someone had planned such an act, investigators needed to understand how and why. As detectives continued their work, they began looking deeper into the relationships surrounding the family. They examined people who knew them, people who had interacted with them, people who may have had reasons to enter their lives. Because in many cases involving family violence, the key to understanding the crime is not found far away. It is found within the connections between people. The Sattar family murders created a painful contradiction. The victims were surrounded by the things that represented their lives, their home, their belongings, their memories. Yet the person responsible had turned that same environment into a place of destruction. That contrast made the crime even more disturbing. A home is usually where people feel most human. It is where people remove their public identities, where they relax, where they trust. The attack shattered that trust completely. As the investigation moved forward, one thing became clear. This was not only a tragedy for one family, it was a case that would remain in Manitoba's memory for years. A case that forced people to confront the darkest possibilities of human behavior. A case that began with one terrible night inside a home. A night when 7 lives were taken. A night that left behind only questions. And for investigators searching for answers, the most important question remained. Who entered the Sattar home? And what drove them to commit such an unimaginable crime? When investigators arrived at the Sattar family home, they were not simply walking into a crime scene. They were walking into the remains of a family's final moments. The house, once a place of ordinary life, had been transformed into a scene of unimaginable tragedy. The damage caused by the fire created an atmosphere of destruction and confusion. The walls that had once protected the family were now surrounded by smoke, damage, and silence. Every step taken by investigators carried the weight of what they were discovering. Behind every piece of evidence was the reality that 7 people had lost their lives. The first moments at a crime scene are always critical. Investigators know that time can change evidence. Details can disappear. Memories can become unclear. And in a case involving an entire family, the pressure to understand what happened becomes even greater. They had to determine the sequence of events. They had to separate what happened before the fire from what happened after. They had to rebuild the final hours of the victims' lives. The discovery of the bodies confirmed the terrible reality. The family had been attacked inside their own home. The evidence suggested that the victims were killed while they were sleeping, making the crime even more disturbing. There had been no opportunity for them to escape, no chance to call for help, no moment to defend themselves. For investigators, this detail changed the nature of the case. This was not a sudden argument that became violent. This was not a situation that appeared to happen without warning. The scene suggested planning. It suggested that someone had entered the home with a purpose. The use of an axe and knife revealed the level of violence involved. Investigators studying the scene were forced to confront the reality of the attack. Their work required them to remain professional, but behind every photograph, every piece of evidence, and every note was the knowledge that real people had been there. The victims were not just evidence. They were family members. They were people who had gone to sleep expecting another day. The investigation also focused on the fire. Setting the house on fire appeared to be an attempt to destroy evidence and hide the crime. This created additional challenges. Fire can damage physical clues. It can change the appearance of a scene. It can make it more difficult to understand what happened. But investigators are trained to look beyond the obvious. A burned home may appear destroyed, but even destruction can reveal information. The pattern of damage, the location of certain objects, the remains of different areas inside the house. All of these details can help reconstruct events. The investigators had to treat the scene like a puzzle where some pieces had been damaged or lost, but enough remained to begin building the truth. As news of the discovery spread, the community reacted with shock. People wanted answers. They wanted to know who could commit such a crime. They wanted to understand why this family had been targeted. But in the early stages of an investigation, answers are often difficult to find. There are only questions. Investigators must work through uncertainty. They must examine possibilities without knowing which direction will lead them to the truth. Every person connected to the family had to be considered. Friends, neighbors, people who had visited the home, people who had contact with the victims. The investigation could not rely on emotion. It had to rely on facts. One of the biggest challenges in a case like this is understanding the relationship between the victims and the person responsible. When strangers are involved, investigators often search for outside connections. But when an entire family is killed inside their home, the question becomes more complicated. Who knew their routines? Who knew when they would be there? Who could enter without immediately raising suspicion? These questions became central because the crime did not only involve violence. It involved access. It involved knowledge. It involved someone being close enough to reach the family. The discovery also revealed the heartbreaking reality that the victims had been together during their final moments. A family that had shared life together was lost together. For relatives and friends, this created a special kind of grief. There was no single person to mourn. There was an entire family missing. The community struggled with the scale of the loss. 7 lives, 7 stories, 7 people who would never return. The investigation continued under enormous public attention. People followed every development. Rumors spread. Theories appeared. But investigators knew that solving a crime required patience. The truth could not be built on guesses. It had to be built on evidence. Every interview mattered. Every timeline mattered. Every detail from the scene mattered. The search for answers would take time, but slowly, the investigators began moving from the horror of the discovery toward the process of understanding. They began asking not only what happened, but how it happened. How did someone enter the home? How did the attack begin? What happened afterward? Why was the house set on fire? Each question brought them closer to the truth, but it also revealed the painful reality of the case. The Sattar family murders were not a tragedy caused by a random moment. They appeared to be something more deliberate, something planned, something carried out with a specific intention. And as investigators continued searching for the person responsible, the focus shifted from the destroyed home to the people connected to it. Because the answers would not come only from the crime scene. They would come from understanding the relationships, the history, and the hidden details surrounding the Sattar family. The burned house had revealed the horror. Now investigators had to uncover the story behind it. And somewhere within that story was the person responsible for one of Manitoba's most shocking family massacres. After the discovery of the Sattar family murders, investigators were faced with one of the most difficult challenges a police department can experience. They were not investigating the death of one person. They were investigating the destruction of an entire family. 7 lives had been taken. A home had been burned. And the person responsible had disappeared into the uncertainty that followed the crime. At the beginning of any investigation, there is a moment when everything is possible. Every explanation must be considered. Every connection must be examined. Investigators cannot allow emotion to control their decisions. Even when the details of the crime are disturbing, they must follow evidence. They must follow patterns. They must follow the truth, wherever it leads. The Sattar case created many questions from the very beginning. The violence suggested that this was not a random event. The fire suggested an attempt to hide what had happened. The fact that the victims were attacked inside their own home suggested that the person responsible may have known the family or their routine. Someone had entered their world. Someone had crossed a line that most people could never imagine crossing. The investigation began with the people closest to the victims: friends, neighbors, people who had interacted with the family, anyone who might provide information about their daily lives. Investigators needed to understand the family's relationships. They needed to know who had been around them, who had access to the home, who might have had a reason to harm them. In cases involving family murders, investigators often look for hidden conflicts, financial problems, personal disputes, broken relationships, arguments that others may not have known about, because behind many violent crimes, there is often a story that existed before the crime itself. A story of tension, a story of decisions, a story that slowly developed before reaching a tragic conclusion. The Sattar family murders created a difficult problem for investigators because the crime scene provided evidence of what happened, but not necessarily why. The bodies showed the result. The burned home showed the destruction, but the motive remained hidden. And without understanding motive, finding the person responsible becomes much harder. The investigation also had to examine the possibility that the attacker was someone familiar. The idea that a stranger could enter a home and commit such a crime was terrifying, but the possibility that someone known to the family could do it created another level of fear. Because trust becomes part of the crime. A person trusted enough to be near a family has a different kind of access. They may know habits. They may know schedules. They may know weaknesses. That knowledge can become dangerous in the wrong hands. Investigators carefully examined every possible connection. They looked at people who had worked for or interacted with the family. They considered anyone who may have had contact with the victims before the murders. The investigation became a search through relationships, a search through memories, a search through small details that might reveal something important. Meanwhile, the community continued to struggle with the reality of what happened. The case had created fear. People wanted to believe that such a crime could only be committed by someone completely different from themselves, someone obviously dangerous, someone easy to recognize. But the investigation reminded everyone of a frightening truth. Danger does not always look the way people expect. A person capable of violence may not appear dangerous at first. They may blend into everyday life. They may have conversations. They may walk through the same streets as everyone else. This uncertainty made the case even more unsettling. As investigators continued, they also had to deal with the challenge of separating facts from rumors. High-profile crimes often create speculation. People begin creating their own theories. They try to explain what happened before all the evidence is available. But police investigations cannot operate on assumptions. A theory is only useful if it can be supported by evidence. Every possibility must be tested. Every statement must be verified. Every detail must be examined. The investigators working on the Sattar case understood that rushing could damage the entire investigation. Finding the wrong person would not bring justice. It would only create another tragedy. They needed the right answer, not the fastest answer. The search for the truth continued through interviews and evidence collection. Investigators reconstructed the timeline of events. They tried to determine when the attack happened. They looked for signs that could explain how the killer entered and left the home. They examined the fire and the damage it caused. They searched for anything that could connect a person to the crime. Sometimes, the most important evidence in a case is not something dramatic. It is a small inconsistency, a statement that does not match, a detail that does not fit, a behavior that seems unusual. Criminal investigations are often solved through these small pieces. Pieces that seem meaningless alone, but become powerful when placed together. As the investigation continued, pressure increased. The victims' families needed answers. The community needed reassurance. And investigators knew that a case of this magnitude would remain in the public eye until the person responsible was found. But behind the pressure and attention was the central mission: to speak for the victims. Because the 7 people who lost their lives could no longer explain what happened. They could no longer identify the person who entered their home. They could no longer tell investigators what they knew. The responsibility belonged to those searching for the truth. Slowly, the investigation moved forward. The darkness surrounding the case began to reveal small pieces of information. Connections were examined. Possible motives were considered. Suspects were questioned. The search became narrower. The unknown became slightly clearer. But the biggest question remained unanswered. Who had the ability, the opportunity, and the reason to destroy an entire family? The answer would eventually come from a combination of evidence, investigation, and persistence. But before justice could be reached, investigators first had to walk through the uncertainty. They had to search through the shadows surrounding the Sattar family murders. And somewhere within those shadows was the person responsible for one of Manitoba's most haunting crimes. For weeks, the Sattar family murders remained surrounded by uncertainty. The burned remains of the home had revealed the horror of what happened, but they had not immediately revealed the person responsible. Investigators had a devastating crime. They had 7 victims. They had a destroyed home, but they needed something more. They needed a connection, a reason, a person who could explain how such an unimaginable act had happened. In major investigations, there is often a moment when the direction begins to change, a moment when separate pieces of information suddenly begin forming a clear picture. For the Sattar family murders, that moment came after careful examination of evidence and a deeper look into the people connected to the family. The investigation began moving away from the idea of a completely unknown attacker. Instead, investigators started focusing more closely on the possibility that the person responsible was someone who had been inside the family circle. Someone familiar. Someone who had knowledge of the home. Someone who could move close enough to carry out the attack. This possibility was disturbing because it meant the answer might not be found in a stranger passing through the community. It might be found among people who had already been part of the victims' lives. Investigators began reviewing everything again. Every conversation, every relationship, every detail that had previously seemed ordinary. Sometimes the most important information in a criminal investigation comes from places that seem insignificant at first. A person's behavior after a crime, a statement that does not make sense, a timeline that contains unexplained gaps, a reaction that feels different from what investigators would expect. Human behavior often reveals what words try to hide, and investigators studying the case paid close attention to those details. As they continued gathering information, a clearer picture of the circumstances surrounding the murders began to develop. The attack appeared to involve planning. The fire was not simply a random action after the violence. It suggested an attempt to remove evidence and create confusion. That changed how investigators viewed the crime. They were no longer looking only for someone capable of violence. They were looking for someone capable of planning. Someone who could think ahead. Someone who believed they could avoid being discovered. The search became more focused. Investigators examined people who had access to the family and the home. They looked at those who had reasons to be there. They considered the possibility that the killer understood the family's routines. This type of investigation requires patience. A person may appear innocent. A person may have an explanation. A person may seem like someone who could never commit such an act. But investigators cannot rely only on appearances. They must look beneath the surface. They must compare statements with evidence. They must search for contradictions. The case also demonstrated one of the most difficult parts of criminal investigations. Sometimes the truth is hidden not because there is no evidence, but because the evidence is scattered. One clue may not mean much. Another clue may seem unrelated. But when investigators connect them, a pattern begins to appear. The Sattar case slowly moved from confusion toward clarity. The questions that had surrounded the investigation began to receive answers. The possibility of a planned attack became stronger. The idea of a random crime became less likely. investigators began understanding that the person responsible may have had a specific motive, a reason for targeting the family, a reason for entering the home, a reason for trying to destroy the evidence afterward. This was the turning point. The case was no longer only about what happened. It was becoming about why it happened. And the search for motive often leads investigators closer to the person responsible. Because violence usually has a history, it does not appear from nowhere. Behind a crime, there are often decisions made before the event, thoughts, actions, preparations, moments when a person crosses lines before the final act takes place. Understanding those moments can reveal the path toward the truth. As investigators continued, they built a stronger case. The evidence began pointing toward a specific individual. The person they were looking for was not simply someone who appeared at the wrong place, at the wrong time. The investigation suggested something more deliberate, something connected to opportunity and access. The breakthrough did not come from one dramatic discovery. It came from persistence, from investigators refusing to accept uncertainty, from examining details repeatedly, from understanding that even a carefully planned crime can leave traces behind. The person responsible had attempted to create chaos. But chaos itself can reveal information. The attempt to hide evidence became evidence. The attempt to avoid detection created questions. And those questions eventually led investigators closer to the truth. For the community, the possibility of an answer brought mixed emotions. There was relief that the investigation was moving forward, but there was also pain, because discovering the truth meant facing the reality of what had happened. It meant understanding that the loss of 7 lives was not an accident. It was the result of someone's actions, someone's choices, someone's decision to commit an act of unimaginable violence. The Sattar family murders would remain remembered not only because of their brutality, but because of the way they challenged people's understanding of trust and safety. The case showed that investigations often require looking beyond the obvious. The truth may be buried beneath fear, confusion, and false appearances. But with time and determination, it can be uncovered. The investigators had finally reached the point where the darkness surrounding the case began to disappear. The questions that had haunted the community were beginning to receive answers. The search for justice was entering a new stage. The mystery was no longer about whether someone would be found. It was about what would happen when the person responsible finally faced the consequences. And after months of searching through evidence, relationships, and unanswered questions, the investigation had reached the moment everyone had been waiting for. The moment when the name behind the tragedy would finally come into the light. After the long investigation into the Sattar family murders, the case moved from the quiet work of detectives into the public world of the courtroom. For investigators, the courtroom represented the final stage of their search for answers. For the families of the victims, it represented something much deeper. It was a place where they hoped the truth would finally be recognized. A place where the voices of the 7 people who were lost could be represented through evidence and testimony. The trial was not only about proving what happened, it was about explaining how and why such a devastating crime had occurred. Every piece of evidence collected during the investigation now had a purpose. Every interview, every discovery, every detail from the crime scene, all of it became part of a larger story presented before the court. The prosecution's responsibility was to show that the accused was connected to the murders. They had to demonstrate that the crime was not simply a terrible event without explanation. They had to establish a clear connection between the evidence and the person on trial. The defense, meanwhile, had a different responsibility. They challenged the prosecution's interpretation. They questioned the evidence. They attempted to create doubt. This is the foundation of any criminal trial. The court is not a place where emotions alone decide the outcome. It is a place where evidence is examined carefully, where claims must be supported, where the final decision must come from the facts presented. For many people following the case, the trial was difficult to watch. The details reminded everyone of the terrible loss. Behind every piece of evidence was the memory of a family that had been taken away. The victims were no longer able to speak for themselves. Their stories had to be reconstructed through the work of investigators and the testimony of others. That is one of the hardest realities in cases involving murder. The people who know the most about what happened are often the people who cannot tell their story. The courtroom becomes the place where their absence is felt the most. As the trial continued, the prosecution presented the events that led to the deaths of the Sattar family. They explained the evidence collected after the fire. They described the circumstances surrounding the attack. They showed the court why investigators believe the crime had been planned rather than accidental. The evidence painted a picture of a deliberate act, a crime carried out with intention, a crime that required decisions before it happened. The prosecution argued that the person responsible had not simply lost control in a single moment. Instead, they suggested that the events were the result of choices made beforehand. The defense attempted to challenge that interpretation. They examined the weaknesses in the case. They questioned whether every conclusion drawn by investigators could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. This back and forth is a normal part of the justice system. A conviction requires more than suspicion. It requires proof, and the court had to carefully consider everything presented. The emotional weight of the case was impossible to ignore. A family had been destroyed. A community had been shocked. The public wanted justice, but the legal process required patience. The court had to focus on evidence rather than public emotion. As the trial moved forward, the details of the crime became clearer. The investigation that had begun with confusion and uncertainty was now being examined in a formal setting. Every piece of information had to stand on its own. Every conclusion had to be supported. The courtroom became the final place where the story of the Sattar family murders would be examined. For the relatives and people who cared about the victims, the process was painful. A trial can bring answers, but it can also reopen wounds. Each detail forces people to remember the moment their lives changed. Justice does not remove the pain of loss. It does not bring back the people who were taken. But for many families, justice represents recognition. It confirms that what happened mattered. It confirms that the victims' lives mattered. And it creates an official record of the truth. The case became one of Manitoba's most remembered crimes because of the scale of the tragedy. The murder of an entire family is something that leaves a permanent mark. It becomes part of local history, part of the memory of a community. The court proceedings were not only about punishment, they were about accountability, about answering the question that had remained since the night of the murders. Who was responsible? After the evidence was examined and the arguments were presented, the court reached its decision. The person accused of the crime was found responsible for the murders. The legal process had reached its conclusion. But even after the verdict, the story of the Sattar family murders did not simply disappear. A courtroom decision can close a criminal case, but it cannot erase the impact of what happened. The families and friends of the victims still had to continue living with the loss. The community still carried the memory of the tragedy, and the victims remained remembered not only because of the way they died, but because they had lived. The justice system had delivered an answer, but the emotional consequences continued. Cases like this show that justice has many forms. There is the justice delivered by courts. There is the justice of remembering victims. And there is the justice of learning from tragedy. The Sattar family murders remain a reminder of the importance of investigation, evidence, and persistence. They show how difficult the search for truth can be. They show how much work is required to bring a case from uncertainty to resolution. But most importantly, they remind people that behind every criminal case are real lives, real families, real losses. The courtroom may have been the final stage of the legal battle, but for those who loved the victims, the journey of remembering them would continue long after the verdict was announced. Years after the Sattar family murders, the details of the crime continued to remain in the memory of Manitoba. Some cases disappear from public attention as time passes. Some crimes become old newspaper stories. But certain tragedies leave a deeper mark. They become part of the history of a community. They become stories people remember not only because of what happened, but because of the questions they raised about human nature, trust, and the safety people often take for granted. The Sattar family murders were one of those cases. The crime was shocking because of its scale. 7 members of one family were lost. A home that once represented normal life became forever connected to violence. A place that should have held memories of family became a symbol of tragedy. But beyond the horror of the crime, there was another story that deserved to be remembered. The story of the people who were gone. Because when a crime becomes famous, there's always a risk that the victims become known only through the tragedy that ended their lives. But the Sattar family existed before that night. They had identities. They had relationships. They had moments of happiness. They had people who cared about them. Their lives were not defined by the person who harmed them. They were defined by the years they lived before the tragedy. That is the part of the story that remains important. The victims were more than names connected to a criminal investigation. They were family members. They were friends. They were people who mattered to others. For those left behind, moving forward was not simple. A violent crime creates a different kind of grief. There is sadness, but there is also shock. There is the pain of losing someone and the pain of knowing how they were lost. Families affected by crimes like this often carry questions that may never fully disappear. Why did this happen? How could someone do this? Was there anything that could have changed the outcome? These questions can remain long after the legal process ends. The justice system can answer questions about responsibility. It can identify a person who committed a crime. It can deliver punishment. But it cannot undo the loss. It cannot return the voices that disappeared. It cannot restore the moments that were taken away. That is why remembering the victims becomes so important. Memory becomes a way of protecting the humanity that existed before the tragedy. The Sattar family murders also left a lasting impact on the wider community. For many people, the case changed the way they viewed safety. A home is usually considered a place of comfort, a place where people can relax, a place where they believe they are protected. But this crime challenged that belief. It showed how quickly ordinary life can be destroyed. It reminded people that behind closed doors, there can sometimes be stories that others do not see. The case also became an example of the difficult work involved in criminal investigations. Solving crimes is not only about finding a suspect. It is about understanding events. It is about reconstructing what happened when the people involved can no longer explain it themselves. Investigators must search through evidence, interviews, and small details. They must remain focused, even when the circumstances are emotionally overwhelming. In the Sattar case, that responsibility was especially heavy. The investigation was not simply about solving a mystery. It was about seeking justice for an entire family. The crime also raised broader questions about violence. How does someone reach the point where they can harm others? What causes a person to cross the line between thought and action? Can warning signs be recognized before tragedy happens? These questions do not always have simple answers. Human behavior is complicated. Crimes of this nature often involve many factors that investigators and experts attempt to understand. But one lesson remains clear. Violence leaves consequences far beyond the moment it happens. The victims lose their futures. Families lose the people they love. Communities lose their sense of security. The damage continues long after the crime scene disappears. The Sattar family murders remain remembered because they represent one of the darkest possibilities of human actions. A place of trust became a place of fear. A family home became the scene of a tragedy. And 7 lives became forever connected to a crime that shocked Manitoba. But the final message of this story should not only be about the person responsible. It should be about the people who were lost. Because every victim of a crime had a life before the headlines. They had dreams. They had memories. They had people who loved them. The tragedy may explain how their lives ended, but it does not explain who they were. That responsibility belongs to those who remember them. As time passes, investigations close. Courtrooms become quiet. News stories fade, but the memory of victims continues through the people who carry their stories. The Sattar family murders remain a reminder that behind every criminal case is a human story. A story of lives interrupted. A story of families changed forever. A story of a search for truth after unimaginable loss. And perhaps the most important lesson from this tragedy is that the victims should always remain at the center of the story. Not the violence, not the person who committed the crime, but the people whose lives mattered. The family who existed before the tragedy. The family whose memory continues beyond it. Even after the investigation ended and the legal process reached its conclusion, the Sattar family murders continue to raise difficult questions. Some crimes end when a verdict is delivered. Others continue living in the memories of the people who followed them. The Sattar case belonged to the second category. It remained a tragedy that people returned to again and again because it represented something deeply disturbing. Not only the loss of 7 lives, not only the violence, but the mystery of human behavior. What makes a person capable of committing such an act? How can someone look at another human being and decide to destroy their life? These questions have no simple answers. Criminal investigations can explain what happened. They can show the timeline. They can reveal evidence. They can identify responsibility. But understanding the mind behind a crime is often much more complicated. The Sattar family murders forced investigators, experts, and the public to think about the hidden parts of human nature. A person's actions are often the result of many different influences. Personal history, emotions, relationships, choices, and moments where decisions move from thoughts into actions. In cases involving extreme violence, people often search for a single explanation. They want one reason, one event, one answer that makes everything understandable. But reality is usually more complicated. A terrible crime is rarely explained by one simple factor. There can be many layers, many decisions, many moments leading toward the final act. That complexity is one reason these cases remain difficult to forget. The Sattar family murders were not only about what happened inside one home. They were about the impact that followed, the fear that spread through the community, the questions that remained among those who knew the victims, the emotional weight carried by everyone connected to the case. For neighbors and members of the community, the crime changed the way they viewed the world around them. Before the murders, the home was just another place. Afterward, it became a reminder of vulnerability. People who once believed their surroundings were predictable were forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. A peaceful appearance does not always reveal what is happening beneath the surface. This realization can leave a lasting psychological effect. Communities often recover from tragedy, but they do not always return to the exact way they were before. There is a memory attached to the event, a moment when ordinary life changed, a moment that becomes part of local history. The case also demonstrated the importance of understanding victims beyond the crime itself. In many famous criminal cases, public attention often focuses on the person responsible, the investigation, the evidence, the trial, the punishment, but the victims can become forgotten. The Sattar family murders remind people that the center of the story should always be the lives that were lost, the family members who had their own personalities, their own dreams, their own futures. They were not created by the tragedy. They existed before it, and their memories should not be replaced by the violence that ended their lives. Another important part of the aftermath was the way the case influenced discussions about crime prevention. When something terrible happens, people naturally ask whether it could have been stopped. Could someone have noticed something earlier? Were there warning signs? Could another outcome have been possible? These questions appear after many violent crimes. They come from a human desire to prevent future tragedies. But they are also difficult questions because hindsight changes the way people view events. After a crime occurs, details may seem obvious. Connections may appear clearer. But before the tragedy, people do not always know what those details mean. This is one of the challenges in understanding criminal behavior. Warning signs are not always visible. People can hide intentions. People can present different versions of themselves. And sometimes, the truth only becomes clear after the damage has already been done. The Sattar family murders also remain significant because they show the importance of careful investigation. The search for justice is not always quick. It requires patience. It requires attention to detail. It requires investigators to continue searching even when answers are difficult to find. Every solved case represents hours of work that the public often never sees. Interviews, evidence analysis, reconstruction of events. The process behind justice is often quiet, but it is essential. For the families affected by the crime, the conclusion of the case did not mean the end of their pain. A courtroom decision can provide answers. It can confirm responsibility, but grief does not follow the same timeline as a legal case. The people left behind must continue living with the absence created by the crime. They must adapt to a world that changed permanently. That is a reality many people do not see when following a criminal case from the outside. The public sees the investigation, the trial, the final decision, but families live with the aftermath every day. The empty spaces, the memories, the reminders, the moments when they think about the people who should still be there. The Sattar family murders remain one of Manitoba's most haunting cases because they combine many elements that deeply affect people. A family, a home, a violent act, a search for answers, and a community trying to understand something that feels impossible. The case is remembered not because people want to focus on darkness. It is remembered because remembering is part of acknowledging what was lost. Every tragedy leaves behind lessons. Lessons about safety. Lessons about trust. Lessons about the importance of paying attention to the people around us. But perhaps the most important lesson is the simplest one. Behind every crime story are human lives. People who mattered. People who were loved. People whose stories existed before the tragedy. The Sattar family murders will always remain a painful chapter in Manitoba's history. But the final meaning of the case is not only found in the horror of what happened, it is also found in the memory of those who were lost, and the reminder that every life has value long before it becomes part of a headline. Years after the Sattar family murders, the case continued to exist in the collective memory of Manitoba. Time passed. The immediate shock faded. The investigation became history. The courtroom became a memory. But the questions and emotions surrounding the tragedy never completely disappeared. Some crimes are remembered because they are unusual. Others are remembered because they reveal something deeply unsettling about society and human behavior. The Sattar family murders belong to the second category. The crime was not only a story about violence. It was a story about a family whose lives were suddenly interrupted. It was a story about a community trying to understand something that seemed impossible. And it was a story about the long shadow that remains after a tragedy. When people think about famous criminal cases, they often remember the most shocking details. The location, the method, the investigation, the person responsible. But over time, the details that matter most are often different. People remember the victims. They remember the impact. They remember how a community reacted when something terrible happened among them. The Sattar family represented more than a crime scene. They represented a family that had existed before the tragedy. A family that had ordinary days. A family that had moments that would never happen again. This is one of the hardest realities of violent crime. A single moment can erase years of life. Years of memories, years of relationships. The person responsible for a crime may make one decision, but the consequences of that decision continue affecting others for decades. The loss does not end when the investigation ends. It continues in the lives of those who remain. For the community, the case became a reminder that violence can leave a permanent mark. People often believe terrible crimes happen somewhere else. In unfamiliar places, to unfamiliar people, But when a tragedy happens within a community, that sense of distance disappears. The victims are no longer just names in a report. They become part of the community's own story. People remember where they were when they heard the news. They remember the conversations that followed. They remember the feeling of uncertainty. The Satar case created that kind of memory. It became a moment that many people connected to Manitoba could not forget. Another reason the case remained significant was because it demonstrated the complexity of criminal investigations. From the outside, people often imagine investigations as simple. A crime happens, police arrive, evidence is found, the person responsible is caught. But reality is rarely that straightforward. Investigators often work through uncertainty. They must examine possibilities. They must question assumptions. They must rebuild events from fragments. In the Satar case, the challenge was not only finding evidence, it was understanding the story behind the evidence. A crime scene can show what happened, but it does not always immediately reveal why. That search for meaning is what makes investigations so difficult. The work requires patience. It requires attention. It requires the ability to continue searching even when answers are not immediately available. The case also became a reminder of how important victims' stories are. When a crime becomes famous, attention can sometimes shift toward the person who committed it. The public becomes interested in the investigation, the suspect, and the details of the crime. But the victims must remain at the center. Because without remembering the victims, the story becomes incomplete. The Satar family were not important because of the tragedy. They were important because they were people. They had lives that mattered before the crime. Their identities were not created by the event that ended their lives. They had their own histories, their own relationships, their own place in the world. Remembering that is one of the most important ways society responds to tragedy. The case also raised broader questions about the nature of evil and violence. People often ask how someone can commit an act that seems impossible to understand. How can someone enter a home and destroy a family? How can someone ignore the humanity of others? These questions appear again and again after serious crimes. They reflect a basic human need to understand. People want to believe that there is a clear difference between ordinary life and terrible violence. But criminal cases often show that reality is more complicated. Human beings are capable of choices that can create enormous harm. Understanding those choices is difficult, but it is necessary if society hopes to prevent future tragedies. The Satar family murders became part of that larger conversation. They encouraged people to think about violence, responsibility, and the importance of awareness. They reminded communities that safety is not something to take for granted, but they also showed something else. They showed the strength of people who continue living after loss. Families affected by tragedy often carry pain that others cannot fully see, but they also carry memories. They carry love. They carry the stories of those who are gone, and those stories continue. A criminal case may have an ending. A verdict may be delivered. A file may eventually be closed. But human memories do not work that way. People continue remembering. They continue honoring those who were lost. They continue asking what can be learned from the past. The Satar family murders remain one of Manitoba's darkest chapters. But even within a story marked by violence, there is a reminder of something important. The value of human life. The importance of family. The need to remember people not only by how they died, but by how they lived. Because every victim of a crime had a story before the tragedy, and those stories deserve to survive. The story of the Satar family murders remains one of the most disturbing chapters in Manitoba's criminal history. Decades may pass, investigations may close, and court documents may become part of the past. But some tragedies continue to stay alive in public memory. They remain because they represent more than a crime. They represent the loss of human lives. They represent the pain of families left behind. They represent the questions that remain after something impossible happens. When people look back at the Satar case, it is easy to focus on the violence, the attack, the fire, the investigation. the search for the person responsible. Those details explain the crime, but they do not explain the people who were lost. Before that terrible night, the Sattar family was not a crime story. They were a family living their lives. They had routines. They had relationships. They had ordinary moments that seemed unimportant at the time, but later became priceless memories for those who loved them. That is the part of the story that is often forgotten when a crime becomes famous. The victims existed before the tragedy. They laughed. They talked. They planned for the future. They had hopes and dreams. Their lives were much larger than the final moments that brought them into the news. The tragedy of violent crime is not only the moment when lives are taken, it is the future that disappears. Every victim represents years that will never happen, conversations that will never take place, memories that will never be created. For families, this is the deepest wound. They are not only mourning the person they lost, they are mourning everything that person could have experienced. The Sattar case also shows how a single criminal act can affect an entire community. A crime of this scale does not end at the location where it happened. Its impact spreads. Neighbors feel it. Friends feel it. People who never met the victims can still feel the weight of what happened, because certain crimes challenge the basic assumptions people have about the world. Most people believe that home means safety. Family means protection. Everyday life means stability. But when violence enters a place that should be safe, it changes the way people see their surroundings. A familiar place can suddenly carry a painful memory. A normal evening can become connected to a moment of fear. This is one of the lasting effects of serious crime. It changes not only what happened in the past, but how people understand the present. The investigation into the Sattar murders also reminds people of the difficult work required to uncover the truth. Behind every solved case are countless hours that the public rarely sees. Investigators examining evidence, detectives reviewing information, questions being asked again and again, small details being studied because one detail can change everything. Solving a crime is not only about finding a person responsible. It is about reconstructing the story of what happened. It is about giving victims a voice when they can no longer speak. That responsibility is one of the most important parts of justice. But justice, even when achieved, cannot completely repair the damage caused by tragedy. A conviction cannot bring people back. A sentence cannot erase memories. A legal ending does not always create an emotional ending. For survivors and relatives, grief continues in private moments, birthdays, anniversaries, family gatherings, simple reminders of the people who should still be there. This is something often invisible in public discussions of crime. The courtroom may close, the news coverage may end, but the people affected continue carrying the consequences. The Sattar family murders also raise questions about prevention. Could something have been noticed earlier? Could someone have recognized danger? Could the tragedy have been avoided? These questions appear after many violent crimes. They come from a desire to protect others. They come from the hope that understanding the past can prevent future suffering. But the answers are rarely simple. Human behavior is complex. People can hide intentions. People can appear ordinary while carrying harmful thoughts. And sometimes, the warning signs are only recognized after the tragedy has already occurred. This is why remembering cases like the Sattar murders is important, not because people want to focus on horror, but because memory can create awareness. Memory can encourage conversations about safety, relationships, and responsibility. Memory can remind society that behind every crime statistic are real people. The Sattar family murders remain powerful because they force people to confront a painful reality. The greatest losses in crime are not measured only by the details of the investigation. They are measured by the lives that were taken, the dreams that ended, the families changed forever, the empty spaces left behind. As time passes, the details of the case may become less familiar to new generations. Names and dates may fade, but the importance of remembering remains. Because forgetting victims means allowing the tragedy to become only a story about violence. And the victims deserve more than that. They deserve to be remembered as people, as family members, as individuals who had meaning before the tragedy. The Satar family murders will always remain a dark chapter in Manitoba's history. But the final message of this story is not only about the crime. It is about humanity. It is about the importance of compassion. It is about understanding that every life has value. Every family has a story. Every person leaves behind an impact. And even after the darkest moments, the responsibility of those who remain is to remember, to learn, and to make sure that the lives lost are never reduced to only the tragedy that ended them. The Satar family murders remained one of those cases that people struggle to understand even years after the investigation ended. It was not only the number of victims that made the crime unforgettable. It was the feeling of disbelief that surrounded it. A family home, a place normally associated with comfort and protection, had become the location of one of the most devastating crimes the community had ever experienced. For many people, the question was not only who was responsible. The deeper question was how such a tragedy could happen at all. How could a normal environment become the scene of such violence? How could a person make the decision to destroy multiple lives? These questions are part of why the case continued to attract attention. Criminal cases often reveal the darkest parts of human behavior, but they also reveal something else. They reveal how communities respond. They reveal the importance of investigation. They reveal the strength of people who continue after unimaginable loss. The Satar family murders became a lesson in how society searches for answers after tragedy. From the first moments of the investigation, authorities understood that this was not a simple case. The scale of the crime required careful attention. Every detail mattered. Every piece of information had to be examined. A single mistake could affect the entire search for justice. Investigators knew that emotion alone could not solve the case. The horror of what happened created pressure. But pressure could not replace evidence. The truth had to be built carefully, through facts, through examination, through patience. This is one of the realities of criminal investigations that many people never see. The public often sees the final result. A suspect identified. A trial completed. A verdict announced. But behind that final moment are countless hours of work. Investigators must enter situations that most people would find impossible to face. They must look at the worst moments of human behavior and remain focused. They must speak for victims who can no longer speak. They must search for answers when answers are difficult to find. The Satar case showed the importance of this process. The investigation was not only about identifying a person. It was about rebuilding the story of the victim's final moments. It was about understanding what happened inside that home. It was about creating a path from tragedy toward justice. Another important lesson from the case was the danger of assumptions. When a crime seems impossible, people often try to create an explanation immediately. They look for simple answers. They want to believe that criminals are easy to recognize, that dangerous people always appear dangerous. But real investigations often show something different. Human behavior is complicated. People can hide their intentions. People can create false impressions. People can appear ordinary while carrying secrets. This does not mean every unusual behavior indicates danger. It means understanding crime requires looking deeper than appearances. The Satar family murders also demonstrated how violence affects more than just the immediate victims. The damage spreads outward. Families experience loss. Friends experience grief. Communities experience fear. The emotional consequences continue long after the crime itself. For those who lost loved ones, the case was never simply a historical event. It was a personal tragedy, a missing voice at family gatherings, a missing presence in everyday life, a permanent reminder of what was taken away. This is why the memory of victims is so important. A criminal case can easily become focused on the person who committed the crime. The investigation, the evidence, the punishment. But victims must remain at the center of the story because their lives mattered before the tragedy. They had identities beyond the crime. They had relationships beyond the headlines. They had futures that were taken from them. Remembering that is one of the most important ways society honors victims. The case also showed the role of justice. Justice is not only about punishment, it is about recognition. It is about officially acknowledging that something wrong happened. It is about showing that victims and their families deserve answers. For many people affected by crime, the legal process provides an important moment. A moment where the truth is spoken publicly. A moment where responsibility is established. But justice also has limits. It cannot reverse time. It cannot erase pain. It cannot restore the lives that were lost. That is why the aftermath of a crime can continue for years. The legal ending and the emotional ending are not always the same. The Sattar family murders also remain relevant because they show the importance of learning from the past. Every major tragedy creates questions about what society can do better. How can communities become safer? How can warning signs be understood? How can violence be prevented? These questions do not have easy answers, but asking them is part of moving forward. A society that remembers its tragedies can become more aware. It can recognize problems earlier. It can support people affected by violence. It can value human life more deeply. The story of the Sattar family is painful. It is a story marked by loss. But it is also a reminder of resilience. People continued. Communities healed. The memory of the victims survived. And through that memory, their lives continue to have meaning. The case remains one of Manitoba's darkest moments. But it also shows the importance of compassion and remembrance. Because behind every investigation file is a human story. Behind every piece of evidence is a person who mattered. Behind every headline is a family changed forever. The Sattar family murders remind us that crime is not only about what happened in one moment. It is about everything that comes after. The search for truth. The pursuit of justice. The process of healing. And the responsibility to remember those who were lost. When people talk about the Sattar family murders, the first images that often come to mind are the darkest parts of the case. The violence, the investigation, the destruction left behind, the questions that surrounded the tragedy. But every crime has two different stories. There is the story of what happened, and there is the story of who was lost. The second story is often quieter. It does not appear in headlines as often. It does not receive the same attention as investigations and trials. But it is the story that matters most. The Sattar family were not remembered because of the crime that ended their lives. They were remembered because they were people. They had their own personalities, their own dreams, their own connections to the world around them. Before their names became associated with a tragedy, they were simply a family living their lives. They had ordinary moments. They had conversations. They had plans for the future. They had relationships built over years. Those simple details are important because they remind us that victims are never just part of a case file. They are human beings whose lives had meaning. One of the most painful parts of violent crime is that the victims are often remembered only through their final moments. The way they died becomes more familiar to the public than the way they lived. But a person's life is not defined by the moment they were taken away. Their story begins long before tragedy. Their story exists in the memories of the people who knew them. For families affected by murder, this distinction is extremely important. They do not remember their loved ones because of the crime. They remember them because of everything that came before. The conversations, the celebrations, the everyday experiences that once seemed normal. After a tragedy, those ordinary moments become precious. A simple memory can become something powerful. A voice, a photograph, a familiar habit, something that reminds people that the person they lost was real. The Sattar case also shows how a crime can create a permanent change in the people left behind. Loss changes families. It changes the way they experience time. A future that once seemed certain suddenly becomes impossible. Events that should have been shared never happen. Milestones are missed. The absence becomes part of daily life. This is something that people outside the situation often struggle to understand. A criminal case may have an ending. A court may deliver a decision. But grief does not follow legal timelines. There is no final judgment that removes pain. There is no sentence that restores what was lost. Healing is a much longer process. For many survivors, remembering becomes a way of continuing. They carry the memories of those who are gone. They keep their stories alive. They make sure that the victims are not reduced to the crime. This is one of the most important lessons from cases like the Sattar family murders. The responsibility of remembering belongs not only to families, it belongs to communities as well. When society remembers victims, it acknowledges their value. It says that their lives mattered. It says that they were more than the tragedy that happened to them. The case also changed the way many people viewed safety and trust. A home is supposed to be a place where people feel protected, a place where families create memories, a place where they believe they're safe from the outside world. When a violent crime happens inside such a place, it creates a powerful emotional impact. It reminds people that safety can never be taken completely for granted, but it also reminds people of the importance of looking after one another. Communities are built through connection, through awareness, through caring about the people around us. The Sattar family murders became part of Manitoba's history because they forced people to confront difficult questions. Questions about violence, questions about human choices, questions about how tragedies can happen. But they also created another important conversation, a conversation about compassion, about supporting victims' families, about understanding that behind every case are real people dealing with real pain. Over time, the public attention surrounding the crime may decrease. New stories replace old ones. New cases appear. But for those connected to the victims, the memory remains. That is why true crime stories should always be approached with respect. Behind every investigation is a human cost. Behind every piece of evidence is a life interrupted. Behind every courtroom decision is a family that has experienced something impossible to forget. The Sattar family murders remain one of Manitoba's most haunting tragedies. But the final message should not only be about the darkness of the crime. It should also be about the lives that existed before it. The people who were loved. The people who were remembered. The people whose stories continued even after tragedy. Because the most important part of any crime story is not the person who caused harm. It is the people whose lives were affected. It is the reminder that every victim had a world of their own. A world filled with memories, relationships, and meaning. And even after the darkest events, remembering that humanity is what keeps their stories alive. Many years after the Sattar family murders, the case remained one of the most disturbing tragedies remembered in Manitoba. Time changes many things. Buildings disappear. People move on. News stories are replaced by new events. But some moments remain fixed in the memory of a community. The Sattar family murders became one of those moments. The reason was not only because of the terrible nature of the crime. It was because the case represented something deeper. It represented the sudden destruction of ordinary life. It represented the pain of losing an entire family. And it represented the long search for answers after something that seemed impossible to understand. When a crime becomes part of history, people often remember the dramatic parts. They remember the investigation. They remember the courtroom. They remember the shocking details. But history is not only made from events. It is also made from the people affected by those events. The Sattar family became part of Manitoba's memory because their lives were connected to a tragedy that changed many people forever. Their story became a reminder that behind every criminal case there are human beings. People who had families. People who had dreams. People who had futures. The passage of time does not erase that. In fact, sometimes time makes the importance of remembering even stronger. As years pass, there is a danger that victims become reduced to a few sentences in old records. A date, a location, a description of what happened. But a person's life cannot be summarized by the way it ended. Every victim has a story before the tragedy. That story deserves to survive. The Sattar family murders also became an example of how communities respond after devastating events. At first, there is shock. There is fear. There are questions. People try to understand how something so terrible could happen. They search for explanations. They look for ways to make sense of the impossible. But after the first wave of emotion passes, another process begins. The process of healing. Healing does not mean forgetting. It means learning how to continue while carrying the memory of what was lost. For many people affected by violent crime, this is one of the greatest challenges. The world continues moving forward, but their personal world has changed. The places they visit may hold memories. Certain dates may bring back painful emotions. Small reminders can suddenly bring the past back. Grief is not always visible. Many people carry it quietly. The Sattar case also demonstrated the importance of truth. In criminal investigations, truth is not always discovered quickly. Sometimes it requires years of effort. Sometimes investigators must work through uncertainty and incomplete information. But the search itself is important, because without truth, there can be no accountability. And without accountability, victims and families may feel that their suffering has not been fully recognized. The pursuit of justice is one of the ways society responds to tragedy. It says that actions have consequences. It says that victims matter. It says that even after terrible events, there is a commitment to discovering what happened. However, justice is only one part of the story. The other part is remembrance. A conviction may close a legal case, but memory keeps a human story alive. The Sattar family murders also remind people that crime does not happen in isolation. Every violent act creates a chain of consequences. The victims are affected. The families are affected. The community is affected. Even people who only hear about the case can feel its impact. This is why certain crimes remain in public memory. They force people to confront uncomfortable questions. Questions about safety. Questions about human behavior. Questions about the ability of individuals to cause harm. But they also create opportunities for reflection. They encourage people to value relationships, to notice the people around them, to understand that ordinary moments are often the moments that matter most. The case became a reminder that life can change suddenly. A normal day can become a turning point. A familiar place can become associated with tragedy. And people can be left trying to rebuild after something they never expected. Yet even in the aftermath of terrible events, there are examples of strength. Families continue. Communities support one another. Memories are preserved. Stories are passed down. This is how people respond to tragedy. They refuse to allow victims to disappear. They continue speaking their names. They continue remembering who they were. The Sattar family murders remain a dark chapter. But remembering the case is not only about remembering the crime. It is about remembering the people. It is about recognizing that their lives had meaning. It is about understanding that behind every headline is a story that began long before the tragedy. And perhaps the most important lesson from this case is that every victim deserves to be remembered as a complete person, not only as someone involved in a crime, not only as a name in a report, but as someone who lived, loved, and mattered. The shadow of the Sattar family murders continues because the loss was enormous. But the memory that remains should not only be about darkness. It should also be about humanity, about the importance of compassion, about the responsibility to learn from the past, and about ensuring that the lives lost are never forgotten. The Sattar family murders remained a case that continued to trouble the minds of many people who learned about it. Even after the investigation ended, even after the legal process was completed, even after years had passed, the questions surrounding the tragedy continued, because some crimes are remembered not only for what happened, but for the emotions and uncertainty they leave behind. The Sattar case was one of those crimes. It forced people to look at difficult subjects that many would rather avoid. Violence, betrayal, human choices, the hidden parts of people's lives. When a tragedy of this scale occurs, society naturally searches for explanations. People want to understand how someone could commit such an act. They want to know what thoughts existed before the crime, what decisions were made, what moments led to the final outcome. But understanding a crime does not mean excusing it. Explaining behavior does not remove responsibility. A person's background, emotions, or circumstances may help experts analyze actions, but the consequences of those actions remain real. The victims are still gone. The families are still changed. The pain still exists. This is one of the most difficult realities when studying criminal cases. There is a need to understand, but there is also a need to remember the human cost. The Sattar family murders show that a crime does not exist only in one moment. The violence may happen quickly, but the consequences can last for generations. The people left behind must continue living with what happened. They must carry memories that others cannot fully understand. They must find ways to move forward while still honoring those they lost. This is why the aftermath of a crime is often just as important as the investigation itself. The investigation answers questions about facts. The aftermath reveals the emotional impact. It shows what remains after the headlines disappear. It shows the difference between a case being closed and a wound being healed. Those two things are not always the same. For investigators, the conclusion of the case represented the end of a difficult search. For the families and community, it represented the beginning of a different journey. A journey of remembering, a journey of adapting, a journey of finding a way to continue. The Sattar family murders also became an example of how communities respond to fear. When a violent crime occurs, people often experience a sudden loss of certainty. The world that once seemed predictable feels different. People begin asking questions about safety. They look at familiar places differently. They think about the possibility of danger in situations they once considered normal. This emotional response is common after serious crimes. It comes from the human need to protect ourselves and understand threats. But over time, communities often find ways to recover. They rebuild trust. They support one another. They remember victims not only through tragedy, but through compassion. The case also highlights the importance of the justice system. Justice is not simply about punishment. It is about creating an official recognition of what happened. It is about establishing responsibility. It is about giving victims and families an answer. For many people affected by crime, that recognition matters deeply. It confirms that their suffering was seen, that their loss was acknowledged, that the lives taken were important. However, justice has limits. No court decision can recreate the life that was lost. No sentence can restore the future that disappeared. This is why victims' memories remain so important. The people who were lost continue through the stories shared by those who knew them, through photographs, through memories, through the impact they had on others. A person's existence is not erased because tragedy ended it. Their influence continues. The Sattar case also reminds society about the importance of paying attention to warning signs. Not every unusual behavior leads to violence. Not every conflict becomes a tragedy. But awareness and communication are important parts of preventing harm. Communities become stronger when people care about each other, when problems are noticed, when individuals are willing to seek help, when people understand that silence can sometimes allow dangerous situations to grow. The story of the Sattar family murders is painful, but it also provides an opportunity to reflect. It reminds people that behind every criminal case there are real lives, not just evidence, not just reports, not just courtroom arguments, real people, real families, real losses. The passage of time has not removed the importance of the case. Instead, it has transformed it into a reminder of the value of human life, a reminder of the responsibility to remember victims, a reminder that every person has a story that deserves to be known. The Sattar family murders remain one of Manitoba's most tragic cases because the loss was so overwhelming. But the final meaning of the story is not found only in the darkness. It is found in the memory of those who were lost. It is found in the people who continue despite pain. It is found in the lessons learned from tragedy. Every crime leaves behind questions. Some questions may never have complete answers, but one truth remains clear. The victims were more than the circumstances of their deaths. They were people who mattered. And remembering that is one of the most important ways society honors them. The passage of time changes the way people remember a crime. At first, there is shock. There is confusion. There are questions coming from every direction. People search for answers because the human mind struggles to accept something so painful and unexpected. But as the years pass, the focus often changes. The details of the investigation become history. The names of investigators, the evidence, and the courtroom events slowly become part of the past. What remains is the memory of the people who were lost. The Sattar family murders continue to be remembered because they were not simply a criminal case. They were a tragedy involving real people whose lives were suddenly taken away. Their story became a reminder that every crime has a human cost. Behind every report is a family. Behind every investigation is a loss. Behind every courtroom decision are people who must continue living afterward. This is why the final chapter of any true crime story should not only focus on the person responsible. It should return to the victims. It should return to who they were. It should return to the lives they lived before the tragedy. Because a person should never be remembered only by the way they died. The Sattar family existed before the crime. They had their own experiences, their own memories, their own place within their community. They were part of a family story that existed long before that terrible night. And that story deserves to continue. One of the most difficult things about violent crimes is the sudden disappearance of normal life. A family may have plans for the future. They may imagine the years ahead. They may believe tomorrow will be another ordinary day. Then, in a single moment, everything changes. The future that once seemed certain disappears. This is the emotional reality behind many tragedies. The loss is not only about the past. It is also about everything that will never happen. The conversations that will never take place. The celebrations that will never be shared. The memories that will never be created. For those who survive, this absence becomes part of their lives. They continue forward, but they carry the weight of what happened. The Sattar case also reminds people that justice and healing are different journeys. The justice system works through evidence, procedures, and decisions. It determines responsibility. It creates an official record of what happened. But healing happens in a different way. Healing happens through time, through support, through remembering, through finding ways to live with a painful reality. A court can deliver a verdict, but it cannot remove grief. It cannot bring back those who were lost. It cannot erase the memories of a family forever changed. That is why remembrance is so important. When communities remember victims, they prevent them from becoming only a part of a crime story. They recognize that these were people with lives, relationships, and meaning. The Sattar family murders also became a reminder about the importance of understanding violence. People often want simple explanations after a terrible crime. They want to know exactly why it happened. They want one clear answer. But human behavior is complicated. Crimes can involve many different factors: personal decisions, emotions, relationships, circumstances. Understanding these factors is important, but it does not change the responsibility for the actions taken. The tragedy remains what it was: a devastating loss of human life. The case also showed the importance of community. After tragedies, people often come together. They support each other. They share memories. They help those who are suffering. This connection becomes one of the ways people recover. A tragedy may create fear, but compassion can create strength. The Sattar family murders remain a painful part of Manitoba's history. But history is not only about remembering what went wrong. It is also about learning. Learning about the importance of safety. Learning about the importance of communication. learning about the responsibility to care about the people around us. Every tragedy leaves lessons behind. The challenge is choosing what to do with those lessons. Some people remember only the horror. Others remember the humanity behind it. The second is what keeps victims' stories alive. The Sattar family should be remembered not because of the crime that took them away. They should be remembered because they were people who mattered. They had value. They had meaning. They had lives that touched others. The darkest moments in history often reveal the importance of light. They show the strength of survivors. They show the dedication of those searching for truth. They show the power of memory. And they remind society that even after terrible events, humanity continues. The Sattar family murders will always remain a heartbreaking chapter. A chapter filled with questions and sorrow. But the final message of this story is not only about tragedy. It is about remembrance. It is about respect. It is about understanding that behind every crime is a human story. A story of people who lived, people who were loved, people who deserved more time, and people whose memory continues long after the tragedy that ended their lives. Some stories disappear with time. They become old newspaper articles. They become forgotten names in historical records. They become events that happened long ago and are rarely mentioned again. But some stories remain. They stay in the memory of a community because the impact was too great to simply disappear. The Sattar family murders became one of those stories. The case remained remembered not because people wanted to return to the pain, but because certain tragedies carry lessons that continue to matter. The loss of the Sattar family represented more than a single criminal act. It represented the destruction of a family, the breaking of a future, the creation of a wound that affected many people beyond the immediate victims. Years after the crime, the most important part of remembering the case is understanding that the victims were not defined by what happened to them. They were defined by who they were. They were family members. They were friends. They were individuals with their own lives and experiences. The crime took away their future, but it did not erase their past. Their memories remained with the people who knew them. Their stories remained part of the community. This is one of the most important lessons in any true crime story. The victims must never become only evidence. They must never become only names connected to a tragedy. They were people before they became part of a criminal investigation. The Sattar case also showed the complicated nature of justice. When a serious crime occurs, people naturally want immediate answers. They want to know who is responsible. They want to understand why it happened. They want a sense that the world has been corrected. But justice is often a long process. It requires patience. It requires careful examination. It requires accepting that the truth may not appear instantly. Investigators must work through uncertainty. They must separate facts from assumptions. They must build a complete picture from pieces of information. This process can take time, but it is necessary. Because justice is not only about reaching a conclusion, it is about reaching the right conclusion. The Sattar family murders became an example of why investigations require dedication. Behind every solved case are people who spent countless hours searching for answers. They examined details that others might overlook. They followed information that might lead nowhere. They continued even when the path was difficult. Their work represented a commitment to the victims and their families. However, even when justice is achieved, some questions remain. Many people who study tragic cases continue asking how such events could happen. How can violence reach such an extreme level? How can someone make choices that create so much suffering? These questions are difficult because human behavior is complex. There is rarely one simple explanation. People are influenced by many factors. Their experiences, their emotions, their decisions, their relationships. But regardless of the reasons behind someone's actions, responsibility remains. The consequences of violent choices are carried by victims and their families. This is why understanding crime requires both analysis and compassion. It requires looking at behavior while never forgetting the human suffering caused. The The Sattar family murders also changed the way many people viewed the idea of safety. A home is supposed to represent comfort. It is where people create memories. It is where families believe they are protected. When violence enters that space, it creates a powerful emotional impact. It reminds people that safety is something that must be valued and protected. It also reminds communities of the importance of looking after one another. People often underestimate how much small acts of care can matter. Checking on someone, listening, paying attention, offering support. These actions may seem simple, but communities are built from them. The aftermath of tragedy often reveals the strength of human connection. People come together. They support each other. They share memories. They help survivors continue. This does not remove the pain, but it creates a path forward. The Sattar case also remains important because it shows how memories survive. A crime may become part of the past, but the meaning behind it continues. Future generations may not know every detail. They may not remember every moment of the investigation, but they can still learn from the story. They can understand the importance of empathy. They can understand the value of human life. They can understand why victims deserve to be remembered. The darkest parts of history often teach the strongest lessons, not because the events themselves should be repeated, but because remembering them encourages society to do better. The Sattar family murders remain a painful reminder of what can be lost, but they are also a reminder of what should be protected. Family, community, human dignity, the ability to care for one another. The final chapter of this story is not about violence. It is about memory. It is about recognizing that every person has a story that deserves to be known. Every life has meaning beyond a tragic ending. Every victim deserves to be remembered with respect. The Sattar family murders will always remain one of Manitoba's darkest cases. But darkness is not the only thing that remains. What remains is the memory of those who were lost, the lessons learned, the commitment to justice, and the understanding that behind every crime is a human story that should never be forgotten.